Hi, Jimmy. How are you?
Hi, Misty. Good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for taking the time this morning. We appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as I mentioned, we're creating a playbook for people who are looking at opening up a new restaurant. And so we've started interviewing. We've had a couple calls with people that are already in that process of, opening. They have the lease and just having conversations with them. Things are coming up of, before I even got a lease or found my location, there's sometimes things that either they need to know, in advance before they even start to finalize a lease. So for example, we had someone who shared how she didn't look at her lease about power. And then she signed the lease. And then later on, as she was working with a GC, she found out she didn't have enough power. And now the landlord can't do anything or isn't willing to do anything. Right. And so there are
Wow.
certain things
Yeah.
that people do need to think about as they are looking at building out a new restaurant. So we thought it would be a great opportunity as well. Just hearing from you and your suggestions on what people, if they're opening a restaurant, if it's in the very beginning, what they should be considering, as far as like design on how to bring their vision to life. And as they do have a location and they are working with a designer such as yourself, what kind of tips and what do you need from them? What do they need to have as far as expectations going into it? We have a lot
Great.
of people who have never even worked with a designer or opened a restaurant before. And so that's what today's call is all about.
Great.
So
That's great.
so we'll turn it over to you and you can just kind of share, just thinking about what I've just shared with you, what kind of recommendations you would make, what kind of things people should consider. If it's, design, the spacing, what all elements, anything and everything you can think of that would might be helpful to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Um,
And if
oh,
you
go
could
ahead.
share just an introduction about your firm and your work and a
Yep.
little bit about yourself as well, that'd be great.
Sure, sure. I'm Jimmy Turner. I'm the owner of Studio Turn Architecture. So I've been in the business for over 25 years now. Started out in retail. Right out of college, I ended up working for Crate and Barrel, and then I worked my way up and became their head designer for their architecture department. They actually had an in-house architecture department. So that's where I started after college. And then when I moved to Chicago, I started at the same time, started my firm and did kind of small projects on the side. So I do whether it was residential or commercial. And then I started working on little projects here and there and got into the restaurant industry and started doing restaurants. Um, and when I moved to California, when I first moved to town, into the Bay Area, I worked with a couple of restaurateurs, which knows, in Los Gatos, and that's how I ended up meeting Misty. We worked for a steakhouse and a sports bar, um, and I've since worked also with a lot of restaurants at the Westfield centers, Valley Fair in particular, doing a lot of restaurant design there as well. But I my firm really focuses on residential and commercial. So there's few firms that kind of do it all. A lot of them specialize. It's really good to find a firm that really specializes in restaurant design, but not only restaurant design, but there's two parts to an architecture firm. Like there's firms that are creative, and they have a department that can develop kind of the narrative for your restaurant, and then there's firms that can execute that and take it through permitting, and they're more technical. There's some firms that can do both. Some firms that are kind of larger scale can take it from beginning to end, but there's not a lot of architects out there that are good at both. People think that architects are just architects or contractors are just contractors, but there are some are obviously better than others. Like same with the when you go take your car in, there's some mechanics that are better than other mechanics. It's probably that it's true in every industry. So the key in when you're starting out is when you're looking for an architect is really ask questions about their resume and what they've done, show their work. I mean, talk about how they're involved in that process. Because a lot of architects will show a restaurant they worked on, but it doesn't mean they worked on the design. They could have worked on the permit drawings for that. Doesn't mean they came up with the design. Some of them, it's easier to work on the permit drawings and the technical documents than it is to come up with like a unique design that's unique to your brand. So if you find a good architect that's a good designer, it's pretty easy to find a technical architect that can then follow up and produce the technical documents that you need to get through permitting. So with that said, I think once you've found your architect really needs to work on some of the what we call a feasibility study. And that involves really a lot of back and forth with the owner. Like you've really got to start figuring out, okay, what does the owner want to do? What's the restaurant type? Like, is it fast casual? There's so many different routes you can take, right? So it's hard to focus. So I think really this first conversation with the owner is for the architect to figure out, okay, what is it you want to do with your restaurant? Is it going to be casual, fast casual? Is it going to be a formal restaurant? And it really all stems from the menu, right? Once you've figured out what your menu is, the architect can then focus the questions from there. So whether it's going to have an open kitchen, will there be a bar? Is it going to have a patio? Is it going to be within a center? Is it going to be freestanding? A lot of these questions will then, like once you have that focus on what type of restaurant it is, it allows you to kind of move to, okay, well, that determines what the equipment is going to be, the service, the number of employees. We're really asking these kind of general questions so that we can start our feasibility study, because that'll determine like what are the requirements of the kitchen, the back of house areas, how much storage do you need, like freezers and fridges, and this is kind of the nuts and bolts of it. But then it's also going to determine the dining area. If there is a bar, are there going to be private rooms? Is the bar going to have a lounge? And you're just trying to get the general narrative of the program, so you can start to program the space really. And that then, as the architect can then take that and do a quick little code study, because the code study, before you even get into any of the designs or the concept, kind of the look and feel, you really need to understand how many seats you can get in the restaurant, right? That's probably one of the most important things to a restaurateur is how many guests can I get into the space? Like if you're building from scratch, you're limited by the size of the lot and parking. If you're moving into an existing space, you're limited by the square footage of the space unless you can expand. And that's kind of a sidebar. That you could have a whole conversation on that subject right there. But the code study, you're going to really create the code's going to tell you how many seats you could fit in the space. But really, you got to start with running the square footages to figure the occupant load. And then that occupant load, oddly enough, is going to tell you how many restroom fixtures you need. Sounds stupid, but the restrooms take up so much space depending on how many occupants you have, and it really can start to squeeze your square footage. So if you need one or two, and you got to balance them out. Like if you have men's and women's, you have to put equal amounts in both. So if you just need one more women's toilet, you have to put another men's one in there. So it can start to add up. And so
And
sometimes
it's
you can put,
interesting that you even say that, because I've had so many people that have had that as one of their biggest challenges are restrooms. They
yeah,
think about their menu, they think about the capacity, seating capacity, and then all of a sudden they start to think of this vision that they're going to create in the space. And then as they start to work with an architect such as yourself, they start having these questions, right? You call them general questions, but they're very important questions that some people may not think about. They know they have to have a bathroom, but if you have to have ADA, if you have to have it, are you doing unisex? Are you doing women and men? And
yeah,
there's so many other pieces that can really change the layout of a location, especially depending on that if it's a square or rectangle, if it's very narrow, there's a lot of things that will adjust that. So I think it is really important to have those questions asked from the very beginning as somebody's trying to bring a new restaurant to life. So yeah, it's
absolutely.
interesting.
Yeah, and that kind of those technical things that you don't want to deal with, right? You just kind of it's not the fun part of the design, but it's also that's when the questions come like, okay, how much electrical load do you need? How much service do you need? What's your gas requirements? Like some restaurants, depending on if you're like a hot pot or something like that, you're gonna have or a Korean barbecue, you're gonna have a lot more of a gas requirement, a heavy gas requirement than other restaurants. So just making sure that you've got the utilities in place that you need to. Because like you said, before you sign the lease, you want to have all that stuff in order. Otherwise, that's on you. If as much as you can push to the landlord to deliver those services for you before you even lease the space, the better. Because you really don't want to start dealing with utility companies. That's not fun. That'll delay a project for sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't know if this is more of a GC question, but I'm going to ask you anyways. So for us, for one of my restaurants, as you know, for Oren's Hummus, we actually have a location in San Francisco, and we're now realizing going through a lot of plumbing issues since we've opened. Every year we've had issues, and it continues to grow. And now we're at the point of we need to completely tear up our floor, and we need to go, underneath the ground because we've been informed from the various repairs that we've had to have and that they've snaked and cambered them and everything else to find solutions that the plumbing actually is very flat, right? there's
Mm,
no there's no slope to it, and so it's causing this backup. And so now,
yep.
for us, I guess my question would be, is that something that you can normally request from a property management or from an owner of, can I have the design? Can I have the blueprints and the design of all work that's been done for plumbing, electrical, all these different facets that are going to make a difference and an impact on my company? So then that way you can come back and say, well, we've done our assessment and we see that there's an issue with this plumbing, and I'm going to request you to fix it. Do you find that that's something that owners can do when they're negotiating on the lease?
Yeah, you can ask for those drawings. What I've found is they don't always get built per the drawings. So you get a permitted set of drawings, but when you get into the field, a lot of things change, whether it's like site-specific things or things that were kind of undiscovered when you go to build. So you can't always trust the drawings either. So the best thing to do is really to send out a survey team, and architects do this, but to send out a survey team to assess the whole space and basically measure it and bring out the MEP engineers, the mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineers, and have them do a site survey and just basically confirm the existing drawings. A lot of times there aren't existing drawings because the building might be so old, but you can easily do a survey and find out exactly what's there. And that's probably the best approach because the drawings, most of the time, especially when it comes to utilities, are not accurate.
And so you can request that then. That would be something I would recommend to somebody who's starting, especially as I mentioned, the interviews we've done, some of the people we've interviewed, they've never opened up a restaurant. They came from the tech world and this is their first time, and they're learning all these, unfortunately, learning opportunities too late, right? And
Hmm.
so one of the things why we're creating this playbook is to give them some things to think about, right? And questions to ask, which is, again, have an architect come in and do that survey on the lease before you've actually signed it, to ensure that if there is something else you need to have that conversation with the landlord or the owner about, you're able to do that. So, and that's
Absolutely.
something you would
Yeah.
provide?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. We would
great.
get the whole team, kind of gather the same team that's going to be working on the project. So there, and that also helps as well. You don't necessarily have to follow through with that architect, but you could hire an architecture firm to really, it's more of it could be a technical firm that just comes in and does surveys. There's companies that just do surveys too, that gather that stuff. But yeah, that can help at least start the negotiations. It doesn't mean the landlord's going to say, "Yeah, I'll take care of it," but it can at least you know what to ask, right? You know what to expect when that comes around. It's just kind of another negotiating point.
Great. Sounds good. Anything else you can think of that would be,
Yeah,
helpful tips, things to think about?
yeah. I think depending on kind of your location, uh, the one of the things the architect will think about is kind of the approach to the restaurant. That's important. Kind of and there's a lot of different approaches, not just the guests. Sometimes it's like the delivery drivers too. Like you don't want to you really want to focus on good flow for the restaurant. So you want to make sure you're not kind of conflicting pathways with your guests and your delivery drivers and stuff like that. Also visibility, approach and visibility from the street. Let's say if you have a street front restaurant, making sure you got signage visibility is important. Making sure there's like a lot of those downtown restaurants have like street trees and it's really hard to see a restaurant sign. So just making sure you're kind of thinking about all those approaches and
Well,
visibility.
And it's interesting that you say that because we actually, I've learned a lot as well going through each of our restaurant openings, but that was an issue for us in our Los Gatos location. The signage, depending on the corner that you were coming, you couldn't even see any signage at all for our restaurant. And so I think that that's a very important thing to think about, that again, you're focused on seating capacity, design, menu, all these fun, exciting things to work on. But those questions are so important because we went back to the landlord, a year afterwards and we said, people across the street can't even see that we are who we are. They think we're still the same shoe store that was there,
Yeah.
a year ago. And we requested if we could, put something on the other side or do, we gave them multiple options and they came back, they're like, nope, nope, nope. And so there is that, more kind of flexible conversation to have with the landlord before you sign that lease. And unfortunately, I have, too many landlords that are not so flexible once you've signed that lease. They just aren't as willing to make those kind of adjustments or changes that best support you and your company. So it's really
Right.
important. So, yeah.
Yeah. Um, and a lot of times it's good to find out during this feasibility study, which is a really important part to have before the lease is signed, or while you're considering. You could be doing feasibility studies for several different spaces, right? At one time, you may be considering between several different options. But I think also digging into the planning codes and zoning, because they'll also restrict signage. Just because like somebody down the block has a 3-foot sign doesn't mean that's a legal sign. So you can't assume that what your neighbor has is what you'll be allowed to do. So, or that could be grandfathered in too. Like there's so many things. One of the things I come across when we're trying to get things approved is people always pointing to the neighbor and say, well, how come they could do it? And I assumed I could do it. So it's really digging into those codes up front.
Well, you've actually helped us already with one of those kind of projects where we're like, but they have tables out front. Why can't we?
Right. Right.
So yeah, it is important for sure.
One last thing kind of on the feasibility side for the study. Depending, like if you have, let's say you have a freestanding restaurant, and you have a parking lot, there are parking requirements in the code too. So you have to determine based on what your occupant load is, your seating capacity, basically, but also your employee back of house load. That determines how many parking spaces you have to have. So a lot of times you need to make sure that your parking lot's not undersized or you have enough parking. Otherwise, it'll be difficult to get a permit. So that's something that I like to do up front as well. Also, I don't like to, you never want to undersize, and you can't really do it per code anyway, but you don't ever want to oversize your parking lot either, because you don't want an empty parking lot. Like people don't like driving by a restaurant, your parking lot looks empty. It looks like you're not a cool restaurant. It's just assumptions that people make. There's a lot of those kind of subtle things that designers, I think, bring to the table. And that could be a whole nother conversation, just kind of the creative side of it and the look and feel and creating that brand, which architects can do, but also marketing does a good job of that too, kind of creating that, kind of weaving that concept through the entire restaurant.
Yeah, I
The key
think
is to how do you keep it from getting themey and gimmicky? Like that's when that's the kind of subtle art of it on the creative side.
right.
I was
No, I agree.
I was
Go ahead.
thinking maybe go into that a little bit about how to translate, your client's aesthetic vision into material selection and
Mhm.
those kind of more detailed choices. I know the last person we interviewed is talking about just going back and forth on flooring and having a lot of trouble deciding. And so, maybe you could tell us how you walk people through that and how you help them in that decision making process and kind of how you understand what they want as well.
Mhm.
Like do you do a Pinterest board or whatever, however you start? Not, you don't have to go into that much detail, but roughly
Yeah.
how can you translate for them, basically?
Yeah, no, that Pinterest is great because I always like to first understand where the owner or what the owner is interested in, because it all really starts there. Unless the owner says, do it for me, which is pretty rare. Usually the owner has an opinion or a style that they're interested in, but a lot of times it starts there and you want to kind of shape that and mold that. And where and to me, it's not just really working through like the finishes and piece by piece. It's really kind of creating that mood board, which you can do on Pinterest, but also it's really kind of creating that design narrative for the whole restaurant. Like as an architect, you think you just deal with the building, but I work with the owner to say, okay, let's create this concept as a whole. Like I want to weave this design narrative through everything, whether it's the color that you decide to go with, the seating, the fixtures, light fixtures, like the flatware, the glassware, like the bathroom design. I want that, I want it to be a cohesive design for the entire story that you're trying to tell. Because it's otherwise you've got a bunch of one-offs and it's hard to make decisions that way. They're like, oh, I like this light fixture. It's like, well, does it fit into this design narrative that we've created for this restaurant? And like I said before, like if you don't have that concept and that narrative locked in, then it could be like overly trendy. It could be, it's easy to pick things that are popular at the moment, but it's hard to create something that's timeless because if you get too gimmicky or overly trendy, then you end up like 3 or 4 years, 5 years down the road, your restaurant looks dated. So, and then you're spending more money to renovate it.
That's a really good point. I like that.
Yeah,
Timeless.
for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it
And
goes
it's
just
and I
real.
did that with you too. I mean, when we looked at the Mountain View
Yeah.
remodel, it was the same thing. I brought you some, Pinterest ideas and
Mhm.
some photos that I've taken as I've traveled around, the world. And I'm like, these are the elements of what we currently have, and here's some other things of what I'm thinking for this space. And
Yeah.
being able to share it allows you to track as well with your designer to say, okay, I get where your vision is and how you want to bring that to life. And then you bring, like you just said, you bring the different questions to play to is this lighting and the chandelier right here gonna work with the space, right? You get to ask those questions to make us think as owners, is this really where I want to go with it? So I think that's
Right.
great.
Right. And kind of balancing out that kind of value added. Like, is this the best place for that? Or is this where you want to add the value? Or just kind of asking those design questions too. I mean, I like um, to me, it's about the restaurant. You think about food, right? And you think about the taste. Like, to me, I like to bring in all the senses. Like, that's whether it's color and lighting and sometimes scent, like whether you're if you're a bakery and you're using the scent from your baked goods, that's the popular one. Everybody knows you walk into a bakery and it smells amazing. But even in a like a formal restaurant, kind of an upscale restaurant, you walk into a curated scent sometimes that they want you to smell. Like they're exhausting all their food out of the restaurant because it's in the back of house and they're actually putting in a scent as you walk in the front door. So and then music is huge. Like it's weird. It's always weird to me and very noticeable. And I hope everybody, it's a subtle thing, but I hope everybody notices it. Like you walk into a restaurant or a store even, and there's no music playing. It's kind of weird. Like it just feels weird. But music is a very important thing for restaurants because that you want to get it helps set the mood. Like obviously sound and acoustics and the type of music you play, whether you choose to have music with lyrics, like if you're a bar, you want loud kind of music with lyrics is, or if you're kind of a jazzy bar or kind of even an upscale restaurant, like you want something that probably doesn't have lyrics, right? Playing. So it's not distracting. You also got to get the levels right. You want to make sure that it's not too loud so that people can't socialize. Like people come to restaurants to socialize and be together and enjoy the feeling that they're having. And if they can't hear each other or if they have to talk over the music, then everything gets louder, all the levels elevate. And then if it's too quiet, it's kind of, it makes you feel like you don't have any privacy or it makes you self-conscious, like people can hear your conversations. So even setting that level for the music is important too.
That experience is definitely key. And it's interesting because one of the things that came up for me is acoustics, right? There's actually a couple new restaurants I've recently have gone to, and it was unbearable. I mean,
Mm,
there was no acoustics in there, and the music wasn't loud, but because there wasn't acoustics, and it was
Mhm.
a very busy restaurant since it was new and the new place to, new place to visit. It was just impossible. Like I could not hear from a tiny two-top table from across the table. I was like,
Oh, wow.
what are you saying? So, acoustics is a big one that people, unfortunately, I feel often is missed. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. And
yeah.
that could be anything, I mean, obvious from the obvious, like acoustical panels. Um, but a lot of times if it's depending on the restaurant, I like to bring in an acoustical engineer, like if it's an upscale restaurant. Because it could be the fabrics that you use for the booths, it could help, curtains, wall coverings, kind of fabric, soft wall coverings. A lot of that
They even
stuff
have it
can
now
help.
under the tables.
Yes. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I've seen it under the tables. I mean, we always do the spray. There's
Yep.
one that you can do at the top of the ceilings, and that's really worked well because we've done panels in some of our restaurants, and it definitely doesn't have that ping pong type of noise system. I mean, it does help cut that out, but it's still a little bit loud. So we have found that the
Mm.
spraying at the ceiling is always has
Yeah.
worked better for us. So
Yeah, the and each space is different too. Like it's not like a one size fits all too. If you've got high ceilings or a
yeah,
lot of
we have high
corners,
ceilings.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Well, that's all very, very good things to think about for sure.
Yeah, the for I mean, one of the things I strive for in layout, like when you get kind of into this is sort of getting into the pragmatic side of the design, but I really think it's important, especially when this really applies to an upscale restaurant. Like you want every table to be a good table. Like everybody's paying the same price for a meal, right? They're all coming in there and everybody wants to feel like they're taken care of. So they want every table. So if you sit, you don't want those tables back by the bathrooms, right? Like everybody sat in one of those bad tables. Like the goal is to make every table a good table. It's not always possible, but that's the goal.
How good to think about for sure. Yeah. And I think sometimes, I mean, we've talked about this with Mountain View. It's like even putting, a big palm or olive tree or something, if you do have to have a table that's kind of closer to the bathroom, it doesn't need to be just a standing table there. You can make some
Yeah.
kind of environment around it to make it feel like, hey, this is a special table. All of our
Yeah.
tables we want
Yeah, right.
you to feel great at. So,
Right.
bringing in other elements like a plant or some kind of design or a little mirror or just something to kind of bring that table to life
Yep.
as well so they don't feel left out and I've got the last table in the restaurant.
Right. Right.
So,
And it's
yeah,
also important to think about the layout of the bathrooms too, like making sure that the door doesn't open right into the dining area or you can't see into the restroom. And a lot of those things help. No one wants to sit at a table and hear a toilet flushing either. So
that's very true.
that's a bad experience. So I think from the pragmatic side too, like to me, it's important to make sure you got the flow through the restaurant worked out properly. Like we kind of talked about this at the beginning with the delivery drivers and the guests coming in, but it's also important for the waiters and the food runners and making sure they've got a clear path to the kitchen. Can the guests find the restrooms? There's nothing worse than walking around the restaurant and not be able to find you end up in the kitchen. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but that's always something to think about. The waiting area, make sure you're not restricting in and out flow for those coming into the host stand and all of that. I like to
Yeah,
keep
I think I think for us, at least Orange, and I've seen this in a lot of other, I Spy clients when I've gone in and met with them. That I mean, I can't speak for every every restaurant, but for us, we do over 40% in to go in every single one of our restaurants. And so some of our locations, they're 3,000 square foot. So we have this space to have a dedicated separate area for to go. So it has no impact on our dining. But then we have our Los Gatos and our Palo Alto location that's, it's small, it's 1,500 square feet. So you can't have that designated, separate entrance, separate area. It's almost like
hmm
your own little restaurant for to go. And one of the things for Palo Alto, I mean, this was 12 years ago, but when, DoorDash started becoming a thing and it started getting busier and busier, we had along our kitchen, we had some, high top type of seating that you could be. And we would have so many to-goes and people walking in for to-goes that it literally was a line of people through our restaurant.
Hmm.
And so it's like if you're sitting at a table, the only small space you have for a walkthrough is now filled with people who are coming through to pick up a, to either place it to go or pick up. And so I think it is such an important, especially today with how much people are doing on online delivery and to-goes, to really think about that in your concept. Because if you are, even 20%, you want to have that a smooth transition so it's not impacting your guest experience. So
Right.
we've, have dedicated areas where they pick up and there's very clear signage of this is where you pick up. It's a different flow from where people come in to be able to be seated. I think that is a piece that more and more restaurants are thinking about, but as a new restaurant owner, that may not be fully in mind because you haven't had that experience of what that
Yeah.
impact can have on your restaurant and your guest.
Yeah,
So I think
absolutely.
that's a really important one to think about as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a lot, or pretty much it for the kind of upfront stuff, kind of the feasibility study and kind of the concept initial layout ideas. But um, from there, then I think once everything's kind of decided and you've got approvals from the owner to move forward with the schematic design, I think then you move into the permit document phase, which just that's when you kind of bring all the team together, whether it's the architect, of course, the interior designer, if you're doing upscale. I like to work with interior designers to really work on those fine details of bringing everything together on the inside. The kitchen designer, like most architects are not back of house experts. So we hire kitchen designers to lay out the equipment, and they're the experts in working with the flow of what type of restaurant it is, making sure you got the right equipment in the back of house. Structural engineers, making sure that if you're hanging equipment, transformers, rooftop HVAC, if you're doing anything with a new build, obviously, but just simple things like the rooftop units, you need a structural engineer for that. The city will require those calculations. And of course, the MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineers, the exhaust, the HVAC exhaust for your cooking equipment and all that is super important to the building department, but also the fire department. Fire suppression is a huge thing in the back of house, of course. If it's a higher end restaurant, I might bring in a lighting consultant just to make sure you're setting the mood and getting the proper um, lighting in the restaurant. And then, of course, same thing for that type of restaurant, maybe an acoustical engineer. Some of those are not necessary if you're doing probably 90% of the restaurants out there, like the acoustical and lighting engineers. Those are kind of extra. Those would be things if you really want to increase kind of the upscale feel of the restaurant. Um,
Awesome.
the one thing that I think all the consultants help with too is um, a lot of the code requirements, like whether it's egress is important. Restaurants have a very high occupant load capacity, much higher than like retail or residential. So you got to work out the egress, the ADA code requirements, fire regulations, like I said, kitchen exhaust calculations. You might have planning department approvals if you have an exterior facade. Even if you're just putting signage on a building, you have to go through planning to get that approved. And then, of course, the landlord. Sometimes the landlords want to approve the drawings too. Sometimes they're hands off, but sometimes they're not.
I'm sure it also has to do with if they're doing TI, right? If they're giving any kind of
Yeah,
TI, they typically will also request that. Yeah.
right, right. What am I spending my money on?
Yep.
All right, I think that's all I had.
All right. Well, that sounds great. Well, we appreciate your time and just sharing some tips and some feedback and things to think about. So that's our goal is to help people who are opening up a new restaurant, all the different things to think about, as well as being able to just have as a reference. You know, we at Oren's have loved working with you already, and you've
Oh,
been a
likewise.
godsend in so many ways. So
Oh,
we've
thank you.
appreciated it. It's been very easy to work with you. It's you've helped with design, you've helped with, property management conversations, you've helped with discounts on things that we need to order. Like you've definitely been helpful. So we appreciate
Great to
it. And
hear.
I know Darren and Dean, adore you as well, and they only say the best things about you. So at some point,
That's
hopefully
great.
the four of us can get together and
Yeah,
catch
sounds
up.
good.
So it would be
This was
fun.
fun. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you
So
so